All right, hello everyone. My name is Julianna Schrag, and I am honored to have been nominated this year to present my research for this year's virtual URICA Symposium. My project, as you can tell, is entitled The Art of Separation, Examining the Micro-Level Communication of Bethel College Students. And this research was conducted last semester, actually, from October to December of 2021, in fulfillment of the requirements for COA 337, which was a class entitled Communication Theory and Research Methods. Let's go ahead and get into it. All right, so this first slide with some fun graphics provides a few sample quotations extracted from interviews with study participants and kind of gives a little bit of an outline of my research motivations. So basically the groundwork for the study is the fact that humans are social beings, right? We communicate to thrive, we yearn to belong with people, we like to hang out with people that are familiar to us, that are like us, and we have this inherent need for comfort and familiarity. So this little graphic that says dinner at 5 in the quotation bubble is an example of a group text that I receive often, in fact, almost daily, with my little group chat of my 3 closest friends, because we want to make sure that we will be sitting with each other in the caf at dinner or at lunch, and maybe some of you can relate. So again, this idea that one is intrinsically wired to attach to like or familiar individuals in public settings is precisely the grounds for my research, and I hope these quotes kind of give you a little bit of an introduction to that. So this next slide details my guiding research questions for this study. The primary question is bolded, and it is, how does the micro-level communication of Bethel College students perpetuate or resist hegemonic structures? And then these smaller printed questions are kind of sub-questions and follow-up questions that emerged as I was doing data collection and participant observation throughout the process. Next, I'm going to delve into a little bit of the past literature and scholarship on this subject. And the past literature on this subject has largely focused on broader components of interpersonal communication as a whole and as a broader spectrum. So I'll explain a little bit these concepts. So social exclusion is a concept largely addressed by interdisciplinary scholar and humanities professor Juliet Schaafsma, along with her co-authors in this particular case. And this article was published in October of 2014, and it was entitled Comfortably Numb, Nonverbal Reactions to Social Exclusion. And what Schaafsma means by comfortably numb is talking about what's called the numbness hypothesis, which implies that individuals kind of have covert reactions to being excluded. So obviously nobody likes to be excluded, nobody likes to be rejected, and we all want to be involved in a group, we all want to be included. So obviously it's painful if you're on the other side of that equation. And she concurs with this, but notes that a lot of times, instead of saying explicitly that you are included, you know your sadness through nonverbals. And there's implications to this. And she also notes that sadness being conveyed through nonverbals could be adaptive. So meaning even if you aren't inherently trying to tell people, hey, I'm being excluded, you could be getting empathy from other people, which could in turn restore group ties. And so that's kind of interesting. And the guiding focus of my study is how in-groups, so right, we hear of in-groups and out-groups, are maintained through particular micro-level communication behaviors. And communication scholars Catherine E. Forsyth and Andrew M. Ledbetter studied these 2 concepts of self-other inclusion and self-expansion theory. And they note that positivity is crucial for relational maintenance. So basically, this is a fancy way of saying we like to make people laugh. We try to avoid being antisocial. We want to have positive interactions because, right, these restore group ties. These help make our interpersonal relationships valuable and long-lasting. And then self-expansion theory is this idea that relationships are communally oriented. So, right, individuals have this, quote, incentive to share resources, perspectives, and identities. So to give you all an example, my name is Julianna Schrag, but I don't just think of myself as that, right? I associate with the people that I share activities with, that I do extracurriculars with. So I'm a part of Woven, the a cappella women's group on campus. I sing in the concert choir, I play in the wind ensemble. I'm a member of Mod 7B, so I associate myself with these people and I tend to gravitate towards them. That's what the authors mean here when they talk about communally oriented relationships. All right, so these next three interpersonal communication concepts are quite closely related, so I'm going to briefly explain the differences between them. This concept of verbal aggressiveness was studied by communication scholars Dominic A. Infante and Charles J. Wigley III. And verbal aggressiveness is, quote, conceptualized as a personality trait that predisposes persons to attack the self-concepts of other people instead of or in addition to their positions on topics of communication. So again, this kind of large verbose definition, what's really just saying this is like competence attacks, teasing, appearance attacks, swearing, like just not very nice language that tends to criticize other people. The authors do note that this can be a constructive or destructive trait. So in some cases, right, this can actually help build group ties and relationships. I have two of my best friends, actually, oddly enough, their relationship kind of thrives off of excessive rude banter, which is something that people may find odd. I find it odd, but it can build up relationships, or it can be destructive and deteriorate those interpersonal relationships. So then aggressive humor is using humor specifically for the purpose of criticizing or ridiculing others. And a lot of times it's directed at certain cultural groups. So for example, maybe people on the LGBTQIA spectrum, racial or ethnic or gender minorities, that type of thing. And it's exemplified through sarcasm, teasing, ridicule, again. So just kind of rude behavior, but in a humor context. And finally, Bishop, the same scholar who noted aggressive humor, also talked about social dominance theory and social dominance orientation, which is basically if you even implicitly consider one cultural group, likely your own, to be socially dominant over another. And then she argues that you would be more likely, if you have a high social dominance orientation, to appreciate and favor aggressive humor. And that's how these concepts are kind of interlocked. All right, so now let's transition to my original research. My participant sample included 16 full-time Bethel College undergraduate students. So obviously students at approximately 18 to 22 years of age. They were all on-campus residents with a meal plan who dine in Schultz Dining Hall regularly, as the cafeteria was my primary field site. I did label the participants from letters A through P in order to adhere to promises of utmost anonymity. I had a pretty good mix of classifications and gender also in this participant sample. It was a convenient representative sample, so it was obviously convenient since this time frame of research was limited and it was representative of the broader student population. As far as data collection, I engaged in 7 hours of on-site participant observation in the cafeteria, which resulted in 7 single-space pages of written field notes, which I then transcribed. I also conducted and transcribed 12 semi-structured interviews. What I mean by semi-structured is that I did have an interview guide with questions, but I felt free to deviate from that as conversation allowed and to just kind of have friendly, casual conversation with my interviewees. And the interviews ranged from 5 to 15 minutes and occurred in a variety of locations, including the cafeteria, the FAC, the Center for Academic Development, and in some cases also the dormitories. Interviewees were all presented with informed consent forms, which they had to sign before engaging in conversation, which just kind of informed them of research purposes, goals, and procedures. And interviews resulted in 25 pages of participant accounts, which I then went through and coded and analyzed to develop my conclusions. And as far as theoretical groundwork for my study, I really leaned on the frenetic iterative approach to data analysis, which was developed by Sarah J. Tracy, who was the author of the textbook we used for this particular class. And it was great because we kind of talked about it as being the perfect theoretical framework for entry-level researchers. If you really don't know what type of theory you're actually using, it's perfect because it alternates between emergent or EMIC findings and existing or EDIC findings on the subject. So I used my own emergent findings and then also drew from scholars that had studied this before and theories that have been presented before. And it was perfect for an entry-level researcher like myself. I also used Herbert Blumer's theory of symbolic interactionism, which basically argues that people's actions result from their interpretations of the situations that confront them in their everyday lives, which is basically just a fancy way of saying everything is connected to everything. We do things as a result of stimulus and stimuli. Finally, I also used Giddens' structuration theory, which focuses on the ways in which cultures, organizations, and social systems are constituted or created through micro-practices of individual people. So this is really important for my study in particular, and how my study advances that of other scholars, because it notes that our micro-level interactions are also consequently related to higher macro-level ideological societal ideas. And that's what I'm trying to do here, is figure out how even a small campus like Bethel College, what we do as individuals relates to kind of these ideologies that society has. All right, now to the fun part. So as a result of data analysis, I developed 3 primary conclusions. The first one is that I noted that there's what I like to call a culture of belonging on Bethel's campus. And there's an example of a participant quote here. I feel like a lot of people do the same thing. They just sit with their friends, and if they don't have friends or a team to sit with, then they're just kind of quiet. And this was a pretty common conclusion brought up among participants. And what I mean by this is that Bethel students seem to have innate tendencies to segregate themselves by groups or pairs in accordance with liking or belonging. And the concept is presented through groups sharing common extracurricular interests, involvement, or living arrangements. This is pretty clear if you walk into the caf at any given time and you know people sitting at the same tables, sitting with the same people. That's kind of what I'm talking about. People like to feel like they belong to a certain group. Next, I kind of talk about micro-level communication habits, which include verbal aggression and aggressive humor, which I've touched on in past research. And I've kind of got to give a little bit of a trigger warning, and you'll have to excuse my language in this case, because there's a few examples of field note observations that are a little bit shocking, and also a trigger warning for content a little bit. So there's a general consensus that humor is a tie that binds in-groups together. We all know that we like to make each other laugh. We like to smile with our friends, but humor can tend to get aggressive or offensive, especially in the observations that I noted. And yet somehow this bonds and strengthens interpersonal relationships, especially within in-groups. So an example from one of my interviewees is that, quote, "We act like how we would in our rooms." This is pretty stereotypical. People like to talk about things that are maybe inside jokes between friends, that type of thing. Another interviewee said, quote, "I feel like people shouldn't be talking about nasty matters at meal. Food time should be general topics. However, it seems like dining is the time that things always come up like that." And I noticed myself during participant observation periods that conversation topics within my own friend groups, especially those including males, reverted to what this interviewee would define as nasty topics. For example, penile humor. Other humor similarly may and arguably should be deemed offensive by most, like racist, homophobic, or sexist humor. And I also noted this in a lot of my field note observations. For example, mutual male friends calling each other gay ass motherfuckers for fun. Or the same friend declaring, "You should go as your ancestors for Halloween because you're Jewish." And I happen to know that this individual who was being addressed is not Jewish. And a stranger speaking to a friend on the phone saying, quote, "At least I have some meat on my bones. Your anorexic ass has nothing." So these were really shocking to me in my research, and also just evidence that there are people that possess this social dominance orientation, right? And so I did connect this to the concept of ethnocentrism, which is defined as the belief that one's own racial and ethnic values and ways of being are superior to those of others. So just being mindful in the future of the way that we interact with our interpersonal relationships, what the implications are for the cultural groups that we may be addressing, if implicitly. And that's a huge observation to note. Finally, I talk a little bit about self and social exclusion. So, right, because of this culture of belonging, self and social exclusion is abundant at Bethel. And there seems to kind of be a stigma attached to solitude. We have this uncomfortability and solitude and being alone because it's college, and we're told that Bethel fosters community, right? So it could be institutionally driven because we're told that we will make friends, lifelong relationships here. And so dining alone then may carry the connotation of loneliness, unlikability, or indifference. So one interviewee notes that some students sit alone, and it's not because they want to. Another note that I made just in personal field note observations was that one of my friends left our table when a spot opened up next to his best friend. And at the time I was sitting with only one other person. And he then proceeded to take a Snapchat video of us and sent it to us. And it basically said we had no friends. So, right, he was teasing, but it's this connotation of if you're sitting alone, you have no friends, you have nobody, and you inherently need somebody to belong. Another example of this kind of culture of belonging at work in the broader context of all of these conclusions is one of the interviewees saying, quote, "Most of the time I sit with my Spanish speaking friends that are from the soccer team. I'm from Uruguay, so I feel comfortable speaking Spanish there." So, right, he associates himself with where he feels culturally comfortable. But then there's an alternative side to this equation. And another interviewee notes, quote, "All the Hispanic guys sit together. They crowd each table to where no English speakers can sit there. If there is an English speaking person, they don't care. They're going to speak Spanish anyway and ignore you." So this idea is that conversation is determined by the company. There's a lot of implications of this kind of overarching umbrella of a culture of belonging. So that was a pretty prominent conclusion that I came to from my research. All right, and in conclusion, I'd just like to leave you all with the following takeaways. My primary findings from this research were that a culture of belonging exists at Bethel College, and that micro-level communication variables help to perpetuate things like ethnocentrism and social dominance orientation. So again, if you're a student, just things to be mindful of in your own friend group conversations. How is what you're saying and what your friends are saying affecting the people around you, even if implicitly? As far as strengths and limitations of my study, I did a limited study of deviant cases and negative cases, but not enough. Frankly, there were a lot of really compelling notes from interviewees that talked about the CAF as being extremely welcoming and as a place where everybody has friends and nobody seems to be excluded or alone. And I think that deserves a study of its own in that sense. I also think as far as time constraints and scope of study, this was a pretty narrow study. There are studies done on topics similar to mine that span over the course of years. And I think that it would have helped to have a little bit broader scope as far as time was concerned to expand the rigor of my study. However, overall, I spent a lot of time in the field and I spent a lot of time coding and analyzing field notes and interviewee notes. And so I was very rigorous in my analysis. And I think that my study helped and was a valuable addition to scholarly literature already on the topic, in the sense that it kind of connects these broader interpersonal communication tactics to hegemonic structures and bigger macro level things. And that's really exciting. And in that saying, I think this opens a lot of avenues for future research that I'm really excited about. We just went through a pandemic. We're still kind of in it. And I thought it would be interesting to talk about COVID-19 protocol and maybe its implementation on a micro level. So how are individuals responding to protocol? Are they following them? Are they not? Again, doing a broader study of my deviant cases, there were people that thought that this is an inherently welcoming environment, that people tend to include rather than exclude, and that there isn't so much of an exclusion culture. That would be really interesting to study. And so then in saying that, talking about discoveries of shared values, what makes people group together, what keeps those group bonds tied tightly. And finally, I thought technology use and social exclusion would be a really interesting study. I had a few interviewees who talk about excluding themselves purposely if they have no one to sit with, if they have none of their group of belonging with them. They use their phones and they use social media to physically kind of close themselves off to communication. So why does that happen, and how does the advancement of technology contribute to that? Would be a really interesting study to do. But that is all from my research. Thank you all so much for listening. I really appreciate it.